Hello everyone, Mark here, Marx Max Muscle, and today we are going to discuss genetics, your DNA. What makes Sean Clarita a completely different person than Brian Shaw? Obviously, it is your genetics. Brian, he is genetically gifted, superior to be a world's strongest man champion, and it would be pretty hard for him with his genetics to be a bodybuilder. And that's what we're going to look at today, guys. We're going to look at the best genetic specimens for bodybuilding. Now, in terms of bodybuilding standards, Sean Clarita, maybe not even the best as far as that's concerned, but in terms of a regular person, yes, he does have awesome genetics. And that goes with anybody competing today. You're not going to get into the sport unless you do have superior genetics. So today we are going to go back in time. We're going to have fun with this, guys. Pop your popcorn. Have a bag of chips if you want. Small bag, especially if you're training for the Marx Max Muscle Invitational. Yes. We're going to go through the history. I'm going to give you guys my opinion on who I believed had the best genetics all throughout the history of bodybuilding, because it's pretty hard to compare Eugene Sandow with a modern day bodybuilder. Obviously, the things they're taking are completely different. So about Eugene, do I believe that he was the finest physical specimen of his time? No, I don't. Just because he was the first recognizable bodybuilding type figure doesn't mean he was the best. Look at this guy. I believe his name was Clevio Massimo. Now, this guy was stacked. He was around in the 1800s, 100% natural, no arguments. So this is pure genetics, the genetic ability to pack on muscle. But in terms of bodybuilding standards, you need more than that. You need a tiny little wee waistline, huge, big, wide clavicle, and I believe those two dudes in the center, they resemble that remark. That is Steve Reeves and Reg Park. They were maybe the two most famous bodybuilders from the 1940s, 50s, things of that nature. Great champions. And obviously, genetically speaking, compared to the other two guys, the bookends, they're small waistlines. They're genetically superior clavicle widths. Obviously, they were head and shoulders above all else. Or were they? There was other guys around back then who, in my opinion, were genetically superior to Reeves and Reg Park, like this guy here. This is Leroy Colbert. He competed back in the early 1950s, and look at the amount of muscle that he was able to possess. Keep in mind, all of these guys, Reeves, things of that nature, they were all using the same stuff. If your argument that it was that they were natural, then hey, they were natural. But do I believe that? I don't know. That is a whole heck of a lot of muscle, keeping in mind it was in the 1950s. Unfortunately, Leroy got into a terrible motorcycle accident and ruined his bodybuilding career, stopped his bodybuilding career. Here is him and Arnold, and he was a lot older than Arnold, and as you can plainly see, he looks pretty gosh darn good. Look at the size of his chest, and his midsection looks pretty small, so he was able to maintain that muscle, and that's a genetic treat too, if you're able to maintain that muscle. But that's not what this video is about. The guys that maintain their muscle, like a Dexter Jackson, guys like that, I did make a video on that, and I will link you to that at the end. But this is more about guys that are just plain genetically gifted and were able to win championships based on on those genetics. Take a look at Paul Wynter. Tiny little wee waistline, booming lats, big arms, calves included. This guy had the lot. Not only the front, guys, you have to take the back into consideration as well, because lat insertions, calves, obviously, like I mentioned, now those are more based on genetics than almost any muscle group. And of course, Paul Wynter, the guy competed from the 1950s to the 1980s. So he had that working for him too. But like I said, this video's not really about that. We're talking premium genetics like that of Jim Haislop. Look at this guy. Could you imagine him on today's stuff? Those wheels. I'm sure he was only taking a little tiny little whiffle of stuff. This guy competed in the early 60s, for goodness sakes. He stopped competing before the 70s hit, so obviously he wasn't on too much. Look at the wheels on the guy. And that waistline, calves, like I said, that is your genetics. And so is the ability to pack on beef. No matter how much training certain guys could do, or gosh darn near any human being that ever existed, no matter how much stuff you would take, you could never achieve an arm like that of Sergio Oliva. This guy, genetically speaking, was head and shoulders above all else. And it wasn't just the front, guys. Look at the waistline. Look at that. You see the arm on the guy. It was also the back development, lat insertions. Sergio Oliva had no weak parts, no weak points in this physique. Sergio Oliva, I mean, he was the very peak of genetics. And with all due respect to Bill Pearl and Reg Park, but Sergio's genetics compared to those two guys, the small waistline, the huge clavicle width, the ability to pack on muscle, kind of made those other two guys look like old-fashioned cars compared to a more modern car. And then there was Arnold Schwarzenegger. Some people would say, oh, his genetics are bad. Why? Because he was standing next to Sergio Oliva? Arnold had that ability to pack on just as much muscle. Look at the arms on the guy. And that's another thing. Arnold might have had more genetic gifts than Sergio as far as the pecs are concerned. And like I mentioned, the arms, the peaks on the arms. But ultimately, I would definitely say Sergio Oliva had the far superior genetics over Arnold, keeping in mind Arnold focused much more on the dieting. I heard Sergio Oliva trained on cream soda and Twinkies, for goodness sakes. And another thing, you could fast forward all the way to the late 80s, the late 1980s, with maybe the finest genetic specimen of his time in Lee Haney, and realistically, was he that much more impressive than Sergio Oliva? I mean, yes, he had the lot, he had the back, didn't quite have the calves of a Sergio, so, and the tiny little wee waistline. Nobody has that waistline of Sergio. So, ultimately, Lee, I don't know if he was better than Sergio Oliva. And then there was Gary Strydom, a guy who never realized his true potential, but could have easily dwarfed Lee Haney, and genetically speaking, was far superior to Lee in many ways. Until, of course, he's seen the back. That's right. Genetics counts as far as the back development is concerned as well. So yeah, as far as Gary Strydom is concerned, yes, from the front, but no, from the back. And there are several other bodybuilders kind of like that, like Kevin Levrone. This guy, genetically speaking, and he was an ultra responder in terms of, things that they were taking in the 90s, ultra responder, and that's a whole other can of worms that I don't really want to get into right now. But much like Gary Strydom, Kevin Levrone, he was not as strong from the back. No, yeah, his back wasn't bad, but I mean, against a guy like Sean Ray, much smaller, he should be dwarfing him, but it's just not the case. And then in a similar type situation is Flex Wheeler, but Flex Wheeler had round, full muscles that, I mean, have to be contributed to his genetics. Some people, there's some uneducated people in terms of Flex Wheeler's career that are thinking, no, that's all site enhancement oils. Nobody could be built like that. That's a superhero. This was from 1991 or 1992. No sites around. Not a sight in sight. So this is pure natural. Well, I mean, some stuff, but you're not going to get that type of gnarly, freaky shape with any stuff. And in terms of the back, he had some good years earlier on in his career. He had a good pose, the rear double. So his back wasn't too bad. but nowhere near to that front development, which was just incredible. Guy's arm beside flexes. Who is that? That's Paul Dillett. He looks pretty jacked too, doesn't he? But more than that, guys, he was blessed with maybe the finest genetics in the history of bodybuilding. That tiny little wee waistline, that clavicle width, you cannot go to the gym and train for that. That is pure DNA, and Paul Dillett arguably had the best genetics in the history of bodybuilding. Calves included, guys. Look at that. Look at that. And when I said Paul Dillett is pure, I'm sure a lot of you guys were thinking oil. But come on. Be respectful. Now, in terms of the back development is concerned, lower half, even the arms, the delts, yes, Paul was the best of the best. But it was the lat insertions, his lats. The lats themselves, when he would hit the shot, you could see they were very petite in terms of the rest of the physique. So was that DNA? Was that genetics? Well, I don't know. A lot of people say that he didn't train too hard. Could that been the main contributor of Paul's weak back? Either way, the guy was awesome. And then you got to get into the conversation of Ronnie the King Coleman and his legendary genetics, his claim of being natural. A lot of people would say he was natural here. Could you imagine that? Well, in order for him to be natural here, wouldn't he have to have been 300 pounds solid blockbuster muscle on gear? Well, he was. Do I believe he was natural in that other picture? Well, I don't want to get into that. Probably not. But either way, many people would point their finger to Ronnie King Coleman for being the most genetically gifted bodybuilder of all time. Do I believe that statement? Well, hold on a second now. Compare him with Dorian, Yates, and I don't want to ruffle any feathers of any Dorianites or Colemanites. We're not doing a comparison to see who's better here. We're comparing their genetics. A lot of people would say Dorian Yates, he has poor genetics. Why? Because he was against Flex Wheeler, Kevin Levrone, who had just full round muscle attachments and gnarly, aesthetically pleasing physiques. Dorian Yates was incredible, guys. Look at him compared to maybe the finest genetic specimen of all time. And he matches him on muscle mass, a lot of aspects. Better calves, better forearms. But ultimately, Ronnie has the definite genetic superiority in terms of the peaks of those biceps. And no matter how much training Dorian did, he was never going to achieve that. Now, in terms of their backs, yes, Dorian Yates and Ronnie King Coleman are the best of the very best as far as that's concerned. But then again, like I mentioned about Paul Dillett and his lack of enthusiasm, let's just say, with no disrespect meant to Paul. Love the guy, he's awesome. But could it have been that the fact that Dorian Yates and Ronnie King Coleman trained like madmen? So maybe the back development has less to do with your genetics? I mean, hey, Paul had the lower lat insertions. They just weren't thick. They weren't well developed. So I think maybe your genetics has more to do with the shape, the full roundness of your muscle. And in terms of that, yeah, I'd suppose I would give an edge to Ronnie King Coleman over Dorian Yates. But as far as the truth of the matter, the guy that didn't train that hard and achieved a much superior upper body, or the front anyway, and the wheels, in terms of Paul Dillett, I would wager to say that he might have better genetics than the both of them. And then you got into modern times, and this is where my video of guys with lesser genetics takes kind of a turn, because they were on so much gear, so much stuff, that it really beat the natural shape, the natural genetics right out of the bodybuilders. And I mean, at that point in time, you go up into 2018, Everybody has premium genetics. Nobody's going to have bad genetics. Like I said, why would you even get into the sport? And Phil Heath, just as an example here, I apologize. A lot of people are going to say, oh, he had the best genetics. Nobody could touch him as far as genetics are concerned. Everybody else looks the same. They're huge, too. They're all monsters. Even Sean Roden, supposed to be a lean guy, he's a mass monster, too. Now, if you are talking current competitors, today's competitors, who has the best genetics, I'd point you to this guy. This is Quint Beastwood. And this guy, head to toe, calves just a bulging. He's got some feathering in those quads, tiny little wee waistline. Look at those arms. This guy, tall as well. I like that. That's genetics, obviously. Not too many guys. Oh, and I guess there's Michael Crezo. He is pretty similar. Full, just everything these guys have. They have the best genetics. Genetically speaking, I'm not saying they're the best bodybuilders up there. I'm just saying that they have maybe the best genetics of any competitive pros today, here in 2023. Anyway, guys, really hope you enjoyed this video. I'm really going to finish it off now by telling you guys, in my opinion, who overall had the best genetics. How about that? I believe it was this guy. I believe Sergio Oliva. You have to take everything into consideration, guys. The lack of dieting, probably didn't train, that hard. The perfect lat insertions, guys. And they didn't have no fancy lat machines, pull-down machines. This was a lot based on natural genetics. And I believe Sergio Oliva had the best #1 genetics for bodybuilding of any bodybuilder in the history of the game, the sport, if you call it a sport. Him and Dietrich Lewis. He was really good too. Really hope you enjoyed this one, guys. I really enjoyed setting it up. Probably just as fun for me as it was for you guys. Maybe more. Have a great one.